April 12, 1945, 7:09 in the evening. The cabinet room of the White House in Washington. The air in the room was heavy with shock and grief. Outside, crowds had gathered on Pennsylvania Avenue, standing in silence after learning their president was dead. Harry Truman stood before Chief Justice Harlan Stone, placing his left hand on a Bible held by his wife Bess, raising his right hand to take the oath of office as the 33rd President of the United States. His daughter Margaret stood nearby, tears streaming down her face. The ceremony lasted exactly 1 minute. When it ended, Truman turned to face the men who had been Franklin Roosevelt's closest advisors. These were men who knew secrets Truman did not. Secrets about weapons, secrets about war plans, secrets that would determine the fate of millions. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. In that time, he had met privately with President Franklin Roosevelt exactly twice. The first meeting had occurred in late February, lasting barely 15 minutes. They discussed pending legislation in Congress. Roosevelt appeared tired and distracted. The second meeting came in March. Again, it was brief, perfunctory. Roosevelt mentioned nothing about the war's progress, nothing about diplomatic negotiations with Stalin, nothing about military strategy in the Pacific. They had never discussed the war in the Pacific beyond general platitudes. They had never discussed Soviet relations despite growing tensions over Poland. They had never discussed the most powerful weapon in human history, a weapon that was 3 months away from changing warfare forever. A weapon that would kill more than 200,000 people by the end of 1945. A weapon that would usher in an age where humanity possessed the power to destroy itself completely. Truman did not know that weapon existed. Nobody had told him. Roosevelt had intentionally kept him ignorant. And that silence, that calculated exclusion from knowledge, would force an unprepared man who had been president for less than 4 months to make the most consequential decision of the 20th century. The problem was not that Truman lacked experience. He had been a senator for 10 years, from 1935 to 1945. He had chaired the special committee investigating national defense, known as the Truman Committee, from 1941 to 1944. That committee had exposed waste and corruption in war production contracts worth billions of dollars. They had investigated cost overruns at aircraft factories, shipyards, and munitions plants. They had uncovered profiteering by contractors who were supposed to be serving the war effort. Truman had personally visited military installations across the country. He had inspected training camps where conditions were inadequate. He had questioned generals about equipment failures. He had saved the taxpayers an estimated $15 billion through aggressive oversight. His work had earned him national recognition. Time magazine had put him on its cover in March 1943. The Senate had praised his integrity and effectiveness. But respect and integrity and even a decade of Senate experience could not replace the specific information a president needed to make decisions about atomic weapons. And information was exactly what Franklin Roosevelt had refused to give him. Roosevelt had not briefed him on war strategy, had not included him in discussions with Churchill and Stalin, had not told him about agreements made at Yalta in February 1945 regarding post-war Europe, had not informed him about plans for the invasion of Japan code named Operation Downfall, had not mentioned the Manhattan Project even once. This exclusion was not accidental. It was deliberate. Roosevelt had a history of keeping his vice presidents in the dark. John Nance Garner, Roosevelt's first vice, president from 1933 to 1941, had complained bitterly about being excluded from decisions. Henry Wallace, vice president from 1941 to 1945, had similarly been shut out of war planning. Roosevelt preferred to make decisions alone or with a small circle of advisors. He did not believe the vice president needed to know presidential-level secrets. The Manhattan Project had begun in October 1939 when physicist Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein sent a letter to President Roosevelt warning that Nazi Germany might develop atomic weapons. Szilard, a Hungarian émigré who had fled Europe as Hitler rose to power, understood the implications of nuclear fission better than almost anyone alive. He had conceived the idea of a nuclear chain reaction years earlier, when German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann split the uranium atom in December 1938, Szilard immediately recognized what it meant. Germany had access to uranium from mines in Czechoslovakia. Germany had brilliant physicists, including Werner Heisenberg, who understood nuclear physics. If Germany developed atomic weapons before the Allies, Hitler would have the power to destroy London, Paris, and New York without sending a single bomber across the Atlantic. The war would be over before it truly began. Einstein agreed to sign the letter that Szilard drafted because his fame would ensure Roosevelt paid attention. The letter reached Roosevelt in October 1939. Roosevelt read it carefully and wrote back 2 months later saying he had created the Advisory Committee on Uranium to study nuclear fission and explore the possibility of creating atomic weapons. That committee worked slowly at first. Progress accelerated in December 1941 when the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor. By October 1942, Roosevelt had authorized creation of a full-scale program to develop atomic bombs before Germany could. He appointed the Army Corps of Engineers to manage the project under the Manhattan Engineer District, which gave the program its code name. The scale of the Manhattan Project grew beyond anything attempted before. Scientists at the University of Chicago achieved the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction on December 2, 1942. That proved atomic weapons were theoretically possible. The next step was building the infrastructure to produce bomb material and assemble weapons. The Army established 3 main sites. Oak Ridge, Tennessee would produce enriched uranium using massive gaseous diffusion plants and electromagnetic separation facilities. Hanford, Washington would produce plutonium in nuclear reactors cooled by water from the Columbia River. Los Alamos, New Mexico would design and assemble the actual bombs under scientific direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer. By 1945, the Manhattan Project employed more than 125,000 people. Construction workers built entire secret cities in Tennessee and Washington. Engineers designed equipment that had never existed before. Physicists solved problems that had never been encountered. Chemists developed processes to handle materials so toxic that mere milligrams could kill. The project cost approximately $2 billion, equivalent to roughly $30 billion today. That money came from the War Department budget in categories so vague that even members of Congress who controlled appropriations did not know what they were funding. When congressional committees asked questions, Secretary of War Stimson told them the spending was vital to national security and could not be explained further. Thousands of scientists worked at facilities across the country. They were building a bomb that would release energy equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT from splitting uranium or plutonium atoms, a bomb that would create temperatures hotter than the surface of the Sunday, a bomb that could destroy an entire city in seconds and poison the survivors with radiation. The project was classified at the highest level of secrecy ever maintained in American history. Workers at Oak Ridge and Hanford did not know they were building components for a bomb. They were told only that their work was important to winning the war. Scientists at Los Alamos were forbidden from discussing their research even with family members. Security officers monitored phone calls and censored mail. Even members of Congress did not know the project existed. The spending was buried in War Department accounts under innocuous labels like engineering development and expediting production. Nobody questioned it because questioning war spending in 1943 and 1944 seemed unpatriotic. Senator Truman had discovered suspicious spending in 1943 while investigating defense contracts. He found millions of dollars flowing to facilities with no explanation. When he asked questions, Secretary of War Henry Stimson called him directly and told him to stop asking. Truman complied. He never learned what the money was funding. When Roosevelt selected Truman as his running mate in 1944, the president made a deliberate choice based on political calculations rather than governing needs. Vice President Henry Wallace had become too controversial with his outspoken support for Soviet cooperation and progressive domestic policies. Conservative Democrats hated him. Southern Democrats threatened to bolt the party if Wallace stayed on the ticket. James Burns had campaigned aggressively for the vice presidential nomination. He had experience as a senator, Supreme Court justice, and director of war mobilization. But Burns had enemies too. He had been born Catholic and converted to Protestantism, which alienated both groups. Labor unions opposed him because of his conservative economic views. Roosevelt could not risk nominating someone who would lose votes in key states. Truman was acceptable to all factions of the Democratic Party. He was a moderate who supported Roosevelt's policies but did not provoke strong opposition. He came from Missouri, a border state that could help carry the Midwest. He had the reputation from the Truman Committee as someone who could get things done without unnecessary drama. He was a compromise candidate, chosen precisely because he would not cause problems for Roosevelt's re-election campaign. But Roosevelt never intended to include him in presidential decisions after the election. The president had no plans to groom Truman as a successor. Roosevelt did not believe he would die in office. Despite his deteriorating health, Roosevelt expected to serve his full fourth term and perhaps shape the post-war world for years after the fighting ended. The two men won the election on November 7, 1944, capturing 432 electoral votes against 99 for Republican Thomas Dewey. It was Roosevelt's fourth consecutive victory, unprecedented in American history. Truman was sworn in as vice president on January 20, 1945, at a ceremony on the south portico of the White House. After taking the oath, Truman called his mother Martha in Missouri. She was 82 years old and had listened to the inauguration on the radio. Truman asked how she felt about her son becoming vice president. His mother told him, "Now you behave yourself." It was typical of their relationship. Martha Truman had never been impressed by her son's political achievements. She treated him the same whether he was a county judge or vice president. From that day until Roosevelt died 82 days later, Truman was excluded from every major decision of the war. The exclusion was systematic and deliberate. Roosevelt held cabinet meetings where Truman sat quietly taking notes, but classified information was never discussed when the vice president was present. Sensitive war plans were briefed to Roosevelt privately after Truman had left. Truman attended cabinet meetings but was not briefed on classified information. He presided over the Senate but was not informed of diplomatic negotiations with Stalin and Churchill at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. He knew nothing about secret agreements to bring the Soviet Union into the war against Japan. He knew nothing about plans to occupy Germany and divide it into zones. He knew nothing about Roosevelt's declining health. Truman later described feeling like a spectator rather than a participant in government during those months. He presided over Senate sessions. He attended social events at the White House. He met with congressional leaders about legislation, but he was not part of the inner circle that made decisions about the war. Roosevelt's closest advisers, like Harry Hopkins and Admiral William Leahy, did not brief him. Secretary of State Edward Stettinius did not consult him about foreign policy. Other vice presidents had been excluded before, but never during a war of this magnitude. Never when decisions of such consequence were being made daily. Never when the nation's future depended on the judgment of whoever occupied the presidency. The pattern of exclusion was systematic. Truman was not told about the Yalta Conference agreements with Stalin and Churchill regarding post-war Europe. He was not briefed on plans for the invasion of Japan. He was not informed about growing tensions with the Soviet Union. He knew less about the war effort than many junior cabinet officials. The first person to die from this silence was not Truman, but it would be the Japanese civilians who would die in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because the man who would order their deaths had been given no time to understand the weapon, no briefing on its implications, no preparation for the moral weight of the decision. On April 12, 1945, at 1:35 in the afternoon Eastern Wartime, President Roosevelt died of a massive cerebral hemorrhage at the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. He had been sitting for a portrait when he suddenly complained of a headache and lost consciousness. He never woke up. He was 63 years old. The news reached Washington by telephone at 3:35 in the afternoon. Presidential Press Secretary Stephen Early immediately began notifying government officials. The first call went to Eleanor Roosevelt, who was attending a charity event at the Sulgrave Club in Washington. The second call went to Secretary of State Stettinius, who was at the State Department. Truman was presiding over the Senate that afternoon. The Senate was debating a water treaty with Mexico, a routine matter that required no special attention. At 4:56, Truman received a message to call the White House immediately. He left the Senate chamber and called from the office of House Speaker Sam Rayburn, where he had been planning to have a drink after the session ended. When Eleanor Roosevelt's secretary answered the phone, she told Truman to come to the White House at once. Truman asked if he should bring his wife Bess. The secretary said yes. Truman did not know yet that Roosevelt was dead. He thought perhaps the president wanted to discuss some urgent matter. Truman walked from the Capitol to the White House through the late afternoon Washington air. It was a pleasant spring day, warm with clear skies. People on the streets did not yet know their president had died. Truman walked quickly, wondering what could be so urgent that Roosevelt needed to see him immediately without scheduling a meeting through proper channels. When Truman arrived at the White House shortly after 5 o'clock, he was taken to Eleanor Roosevelt's study on the second floor. Eleanor was waiting with her daughter Anna and her son-in-law John Botiger. As soon as Truman entered, Eleanor walked toward him and placed her hand on his shoulder. She said simply, "Harry, the president is dead." Truman stood silent for a moment, absorbing what he had just heard. Then his instinct for courtesy took over. He asked Eleanor if there was anything he could do for her. It was the kind of thing people say at funerals, an automatic response to grief. But the question revealed Truman's character. Even in that moment, learning that he would become president, his first thought was to offer help to the widow. Eleanor replied with words that revealed the magnitude of what was coming. She looked at Truman steadily and said, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." Those words captured the reality. Roosevelt had led the nation through 12 years of depression and war. He had built the New Deal. He had forged alliances with Britain and the Soviet Union. He had overseen military strategy across 2 oceans. He had negotiated with Churchill and Stalin about the shape of the post-war world. And he had done all of it while keeping his vice president almost completely ignorant of the details. Now Truman would have to make all those decisions. He would have to lead the war effort without having been briefed on military plans. He would have to negotiate with Stalin without understanding what had been agreed at Yalta. He would have to manage the alliance with Britain without knowing Churchill's concerns. He would have to oversee the occupation of Germany without knowing Roosevelt's intentions. And most critically, he would have to decide what to do about a weapon he did not yet know existed. At 7:09 that evening, Truman took the oath of office in the Cabinet Room. Chief Justice Harlan Stone administered the oath. The ceremony lasted exactly 1 minute. Truman spoke the words in a clear, firm voice despite the shock he felt. His hand did not shake when he placed it on the Bible. He looked directly at Stone as he repeated the oath. When the ceremony ended, Truman became the 33rd President of the United States. He was 60 years old. He had been a county judge, a senator, and vice president for 82 days. Now he commanded the largest military force ever assembled. He controlled a budget of billions of dollars. He led a nation of 140 million people. And he knew almost nothing about the secret weapons programs that would define his presidency. That evening, Secretary of War Henry Stimson approached Truman and asked for a private word. Stimson was 77 years old, a veteran of government service dating back to Theodore Roosevelt's administration. He had overseen the Manhattan Project since its inception. He knew what Truman needed to learn. But that night was not the time. The nation was in shock. Roosevelt had been president for 12 years. Many Americans had never known another president. Truman needed to address immediate concerns about the transition of power. Stimson simply mentioned that there was an immense project he needed to discuss soon. Truman said they would talk later. 12 days passed. Germany was on the verge of collapse. American casualties in the Pacific were averaging more than 900 per day. The invasion of Okinawa had begun April 1st, 12 days before Truman became president. The battle would rage for 82 days and cost the lives of 12,520 Americans. Truman spent those first 12 days trying to understand a job he had not been prepared for. He met with Roosevelt's cabinet and asked them all to stay. He met with military commanders to discuss the war in Europe and the Pacific. He met with congressional leaders to address domestic policy. He read reports and intelligence summaries and position papers until his eyes ached, but he did not yet know about the bomb. And every day that passed was a day closer to the moment when he would have to decide whether to use it. On April 24, Stimson requested an urgent meeting. Truman agreed to see him the next day. On April 25 at noon, Stimson entered the Oval Office carrying a memorandum. With him was Brigadier General Leslie Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project. Stimson's memorandum began with a single sentence. Within 4 months we shall, in all probability, have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history. Truman read the sentence and looked up at Stimson. Stimson explained that the United States had been developing atomic weapons since 1942. He described the scientific principles of nuclear fission. He described the facilities in Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos. He described the $2 billion that had been spent without congressional knowledge. He described a bomb powerful enough to destroy an entire city. General Groves provided the technical details. He explained that the bomb used either enriched uranium or plutonium. He explained that the weapon would create a chain reaction releasing energy from splitting atoms. He explained that tests would begin in July and that bombs could be ready for deployment by August. The briefing lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, Stimson warned Truman gravely that modern civilization might be completely destroyed by such weapons. He said the future of mankind would be shaped by how these bombs were used and controlled. He expressed uncertainty about whether the weapon should ever be used because he feared it was powerful enough to end the world. Truman sat in silence for several moments after Stimson finished. Then he said he understood why Stimson had not been able to tell him sooner. He authorized continuation of the project. He agreed to appoint an interim committee to advise him on whether and how to use the bomb. That night, Truman wrote in his diary that the United States was perfecting an explosive great enough to destroy the whole world. He wrote that he had been informed about the weapon's power and felt the same fear Stimson had expressed, but the decision about what to do with that weapon would ultimately be his alone. The weight of that decision was compounded by the fact that Truman had been given no time to prepare. Roosevelt had died with all the knowledge locked in his mind. The briefings Truman received in those first weeks were necessarily compressed. He was learning in hours what Roosevelt had absorbed over years. The scientists who built the bomb had their own concerns. Many of them had initially supported the project because they feared Nazi Germany would develop atomic weapons first. But Germany had surrendered on May 8, 1945, just 13 days after Truman learned the bomb existed. With Germany defeated, the original justification for the Manhattan Project had vanished. In June 1945, a group of scientists at the University of Chicago drafted what became known as the Frank Report. James Frank chaired the Committee on the Social and Political Implications of the Atomic Bomb. The report argued that using atomic weapons against Japan without warning would sacrifice America's moral position and trigger a nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. The Frank Report recommended that the United States conduct a demonstration of the bomb's power on an uninhabited island with representatives from the United Nations present. This demonstration would give Japan a final chance to surrender before the weapon was used on cities. The report reached the interim committee, but was dismissed. Leo Szilard, the physicist who had first warned Roosevelt about atomic weapons in 1939, went further. In July 1945, he drafted a petition directly to President Truman. The petition argued that atomic bombs could not be justified unless Japan was first given detailed terms of surrender and an opportunity to accept them. 70 scientists at the Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory signed the petition. Szilard tried to deliver the petition through official channels. He first approached James Burns, who was about to be named Secretary of State. Burns refused to pass the petition to Truman. Burns believed the scientists were naive about political realities. He saw no value in their moral concerns. Szilard then submitted the petition through military channels, following protocol established by General Groves. The The petition went from scientist Arthur Compton to Colonel Kenneth Nichols to General Groves himself. Groves held the petition until August 1st, then sent it to Stimson's office, where it was simply filed as secret. It never reached Stimson. It never reached Truman. The petition that 70 scientists had signed asking the president to consider the moral implications of using atomic weapons was blocked at every level of the chain of command. Truman never saw it. He never knew that some of the men who built the bomb were pleading with him not to use it without warning. This was the second silence. Roosevelt's silence had denied Truman preparation. Now Groves' silence denied him perspective. The scientists who understood the weapon's implications were prevented from speaking to the man who would decide whether to use it. By late June, the interim committee had made its recommendation. The committee included Stimson, Burns, and several prominent scientists and statesmen. They debated whether to demonstrate the bomb or use it directly on Japan. They considered warning the Japanese before the attack. They discussed long-term implications for international relations and arms control. On June 1st, the interim committee voted to recommend immediate use of the atomic bomb against Japan without prior warning. They argued that a demonstration might fail to impress the Japanese military leadership. They argued that America had only 2 bombs ready and could not waste one on a demonstration that might not produce surrender. They argued that shocking Japan into submission quickly would save American lives that would be lost in an invasion. Truman received this recommendation and accepted it. He later said he saw no alternative. But his acceptance was shaped by the information he had and the information he lacked. He knew about American casualties in the Pacific. He knew about Japanese resistance on Okinawa, where civilians had fought alongside soldiers. He knew that military planners estimated an invasion of Japan's home islands could cost 500,000 American casualties. What Truman did not fully grasp was the moral weight that scientists like Szilard and Frank understood. He had been president for less than 2 months. He had learned about the bomb's existence less than 6 weeks earlier. He was making the most consequential decision in history with a fraction of the knowledge he needed. The test came on July 16, 1945, at the Trinity site near Alamogordo, New Mexico. The location was a remote section of the Jornada del Muerto Desert, chosen for its isolation. Scientists had assembled the plutonium bomb called the Gadget on a 100-foot steel tower. They had evacuated ranchers from surrounding areas without telling them why. At 5:29 in the morning Mountain Wartime, the world's first atomic bomb exploded in the desert darkness. The blast was visible and felt across New Mexico. Residents in Santa Fe, 120 miles away, saw the flash through their windows. People in El Paso, Texas, 180 miles south, reported seeing unusual light in the northern sky. The sound of the explosion was heard in Silver City, 120 miles to the west. The blast created a fireball that expanded to 600 feet in diameter in the first seconds. Temperatures at the center exceeded 100 million degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the interior of the Sunday. The heat was so intense it vaporized the steel tower and melted the desert sand into a green radioactive glass that scientists later named trinitite. The mushroom cloud rose 7.5 miles into the sky in less than 2 minutes. The light was brighter than 20 suns, visible even through dark goggles that observers wore. Men stationed 10 miles from ground zero were knocked down by the shock wave. Windows shattered in buildings 40 miles away. The explosion created a crater 240 feet wide and 10 feet deep. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of Los Alamos, watched the test from a control bunker 10,000 yards away. In that moment of success and horror, he recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scripture he had studied years earlier. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The words captured what he felt, that humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director who had overseen months of preparation, turned to Oppenheimer and said simply, "Now we are all sons of bitches." Bainbridge understood immediately that they had created a weapon that would change warfare forever, that would make future wars potentially unwinnable, that would burden humanity with the power to destroy itself. General Groves, watching from a nearby observation post, was more pragmatic. He immediately sent a coded message to Washington confirming success. The message reached Secretary of War Stimson, who was with President Truman at the Potsdam Conference in Germany. The news arrived on July 16, the first day of the conference. Truman was meeting with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill to discuss post-war arrangements in Europe. The conference was taking place at Cecilienhof Palace in Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin. The palace had survived the bombing that devastated much of the German capital. It was surrounded by gardens and provided a neutral location for the three powers to negotiate. The agenda for Potsdam was enormous. They needed to decide how to administer defeated Germany, how to divide it into occupation zones, what reparations Germany would pay, what would happen to Nazi war criminals. They needed to discuss Poland's borders, which Stalin wanted to shift westward, compensating Poland with German territory. They needed to address the future of Eastern Europe, where Soviet troops now occupied most of the territory. But Truman also wanted to discuss Soviet entry into the war against Japan. At Yalta in February, Roosevelt had agreed that the Soviet Union would attack Japan 3 months after Germany surrendered. That deadline was approaching. Stalin had promised to invade Japanese-held Manchuria in August. Truman needed to coordinate the timing. The successful test of the atomic bomb changed Truman's calculations about Soviet help against Japan. With atomic weapons, the United States might be able to force Japanese surrender without Soviet intervention. That would give America more control over Japan's post-war government and prevent Stalin from claiming territory or influence in East Asia. On July 24, after several days of negotiations, Truman decided to inform Stalin about the new weapon. He did not reveal details but mentioned casually that the United States had developed a weapon of unusual destructive power. Truman later wrote that he watched Stalin's face carefully to gauge his reaction. Stalin showed no surprise. He simply said he hoped the United States would use it against Japan to good effect. Stalin asked no questions about the weapon's nature or how it worked. He appeared almost indifferent to the news. Truman and Churchill were puzzled by Stalin's calm response. They had expected more curiosity or concern. What they did not know was that Stalin already knew about the atomic bomb in considerable detail. Soviet spies working on the Manhattan Project had been feeding information to Moscow for more than 2 years. Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist who had fled the Nazis and worked at Los Alamos, had passed detailed technical data to Soviet intelligence starting in 1943. Fuchs had provided information about bomb design, plutonium production, and the implosion mechanism. David Greenglass, an army machinist at Los Alamos, had also spied for the Soviets, providing mechanical drawings and specifications. Thanks to these spies, Stalin knew that America was developing atomic weapons before Truman did. Soviet scientists were already working on their own bomb program, based partly on stolen American research. Stalin's indifferent reaction at Potsdam was deliberate. He wanted to conceal how much he knew and how seriously he took the threat. On July 26, the United States, Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The declaration was transmitted by radio and distributed as leaflets over Japanese cities. It laid out terms for Japan's post-war status. Japan would lose all territory gained through conquest. The Japanese military would be disarmed. War criminals would be prosecuted. Japan would be occupied by Allied forces until a democratic government was established. The declaration warned that refusal to surrender would result in prompt and utter destruction of Japan, but did not specifically mention atomic weapons. The authors of the declaration deliberately kept the language vague. They wanted to leave Japan guessing about what new capabilities America possessed. They hoped the ambiguous threat combined with the obvious military situation might convince Japanese leaders to surrender without further fighting. Japan's Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki received the declaration on July 27. He convened the Supreme War Council to discuss Japan's response. The council was divided. Some members, including Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, favored accepting the terms with the sole condition that Emperor Hirohito retain his position. Others, including War Minister Korechika Anami and the military chiefs of staff, insisted on continuing to fight. Suzuki tried to buy time by saying nothing publicly about the declaration. He hoped to negotiate through Soviet mediation, not knowing that Stalin had already committed to entering the war against Japan. But Japanese reporters asked Suzuki for comment. Under pressure, Suzuki said Japan would mokusatsu the declaration, a Japanese word that can mean either ignore or withhold comment, depending on context. Allied translators interpreted mokusatsu as rejection. They believed Japan had decisively refused the surrender terms. In reality, Japan's leadership was still debating internally what to do, but the ambiguous public statement convinced Truman and his advisers that Japan would fight to the end unless forced to surrender by overwhelming force. Truman made his final decision on July 25, the day before the Potsdam Declaration was issued. He wrote in his diary that the bomb would be used against military targets with minimal civilian casualties, but both Hiroshima and Nagasaki were cities with large civilian populations. The military targets included army headquarters, naval facilities, and industrial plants mixed throughout residential neighborhoods. There was no way to use the bombs without killing tens of thousands of civilians. Truman wrote that he had ordered the military to avoid killing women and children, but this was self-deception. He knew what the bomb would do. Stimson had explained the weapon's power. Intelligence reports described Hiroshima's population at around 350,000 people. The military had selected it as a target precisely because it was a major city that had not been heavily bombed, meaning the atomic bomb's effects could be clearly demonstrated. On July 31, Truman gave Secretary of War Stimson authorization to release a statement about the bomb when ready, but not before August 2nd. The order to use the weapon had already been transmitted to General Carl Spaatz of the United States Army Strategic Air Forces. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning local time, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released an atomic bomb code named Little Boy over Hiroshima, Japan. The bomb detonated 1,900 feet above the city. The explosion killed an estimated 70,000 people instantly. The heat wave that followed killed tens of thousands more. By the end of 1945, total deaths from the bombing reached approximately 140,000. Truman was aboard the USS Augusta returning from Potsdam when news reached him that Hiroshima had been destroyed. He announced to the crew that the mission was successful. He released a prepared statement explaining that the United States had used atomic weapons to force Japan to surrender and end the war. Japan did not surrender immediately. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb code named Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki. This bomb killed approximately 70,000 people. Japan announced its surrender on August 15. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Truman would maintain for the rest of his life that he made the right decision. He said the bombs saved American lives that would have been lost in an invasion. He said Japan had been warned and had refused to surrender. He said he never lost sleep over the decision and felt no regret. But decades later, Truman's grandson revealed a different story. In private, Truman had admitted doubts. When photographer Joe O'Donnell asked him directly if he had regrets, Truman replied, "Hell yes. You do not do something like that without thinking about it." He did not want to use the bombs, but felt he had to in order to stop the war and save both American and Japanese lives. The scientists who had tried to warn him continued their work after the war ended. Leo Szilard never returned to nuclear physics. He shifted his research to molecular biology, feeling he had contributed enough to weapons of destruction. In 1946, Szilard and Albert Einstein created the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists to advocate for international control of nuclear weapons and prevent an arms race. The committee published essays and gave speeches warning about the dangers of nuclear proliferation. Einstein wrote in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists that the unleashed power of the atom had changed everything except the way humans think, and that solving this problem required a new type of thinking. Szilard traveled to Washington repeatedly to lobby for international agreements limiting nuclear weapons development. But their warnings went largely unheeded. The United States military and political establishment saw atomic weapons as a source of power and security, not primarily as a threat. General Groves argued that America should maintain its atomic monopoly as long as possible. Secretary of State Burns believed atomic weapons gave America leverage in negotiations with the Soviet Union. Few in government wanted to share atomic secrets with potential adversaries. The Szilard petition that never reached Truman was declassified in 1961, 16 years after the war ended. When it became public, many people realized that the president had been denied crucial information about the bomb's moral implications. The petition showed that 70 scientists who built the weapon had serious reservations about using it without warning Japan and allowing them a chance to surrender. Historians later debated whether the petition would have changed Truman's decision if he had seen it. Some argued that Truman was committed to using the bombs regardless of scientific objections. Others believed he might have considered a demonstration or a warning if he had known about the scientists' concerns. The proscient concerns. Question remains unanswerable because the petition never reached him. Henry Stimson retired as Secretary of War in September 1945 at age 78. His health had deteriorated during the war years. In his final months in office, he pushed for international control of atomic energy, but found little support in Truman's administration. After retirement, Stimson spent years writing about his role in the Manhattan Project. In a 1947 article for Harper's Magazine titled "The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb," Stimson defended the choice to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He argued that the weapons had saved hundreds of thousands of American lives that would have been lost in an invasion. He maintained that Japan had been warned through the Potsdam Declaration and had refused to surrender. He said the decision was justified by the circumstances of total war, but Stimson never mentioned the Szilard petition in his writings. He never acknowledged that 70 scientists had asked Truman to reconsider using the bombs without warning. Whether Stimson knew about the petition being blocked is unclear from available records. If he did know, he chose not to discuss it publicly. The omission was significant because it shaped the historical narrative about whether alternatives to using the bombs had been seriously considered. General Leslie Groves remained proud of the Manhattan Project until his death in 1970. He wrote a memoir titled "Now It Can Be Told," in which he described the technical achievements and organizational challenges of building atomic weapons. He defended the security measures that compartmentalized information and prevented workers from knowing what they were building. Groves never expressed regret about blocking the Szilard petition from reaching Truman. He believed scientists should not interfere in military and political decisions about using weapons. In his view, scientists' job was to build what they were asked to build, not to question whether it should be used. This attitude reflected a broader division between scientific and military culture that would persist throughout the Cold War. James Burns served as Secretary of State from July 1945 to January 1947. During his tenure, he took a hard line in negotiations with the Soviet Union, partly because he believed America's atomic monopoly gave it leverage. He resisted proposals for international control of atomic energy, fearing it would weaken American power. Burns never publicly acknowledged that he had refused to pass Szilard's concerns to Truman in the spring of 1945. In his later memoirs, Burns defended the decision to use atomic weapons as necessary to end the war quickly and establish American dominance in the post-war world. He portrayed the choice as straightforward, ignoring the moral complexities that troubled scientists like Szilard and Frank. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, 4 years after Hiroshima. The nuclear arms race that Frank and Szilard had warned about became reality. By the 1960s, the United States and Soviet Union had built enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization many times over. Truman left office in January 1953. He returned to Independence, Missouri, where he built his presidential library and wrote his memoirs. He spent his retirement defending his decision to use atomic weapons. When journalists asked about it, he would repeat that the bombs had saved American lives and ended the war. Privately, Truman acknowledged the burden differently. He told friends that the decision weighed on him. He said he understood the magnitude of what had been unleashed. He knew that he had been the first leader to use atomic weapons and hoped he would be the last. Truman died on December 26, 1972, at age 88. His obituary described him as the president who ended World War II with atomic bombs. It mentioned his foreign policy achievements, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO. It noted that he had assumed the presidency after 82 days as vice president, but his obituary did not mention that he had been kept in the dark about the most important project of the war. It did not mention that Roosevelt had refused to brief him on the weapon that would define his presidency. It did not mention that 70 scientists had tried to warn him about the bomb's implications, and their warning had never reached him. The Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri holds thousands of documents from his presidency. Among them is a copy of the Szilard petition that Truman never saw in 1945. Visitors to the library can read the petition and understand what the president did not know when he made his decision. The petition is preserved in a climate-controlled vault along with Truman's diary entry from July 25, 1945, where he wrote that the bomb might be the fire destruction prophesied after Noah and his ark. The juxtaposition is striking. Truman understood the apocalyptic implications of the weapon, but he never knew that the men who built it were pleading with him to use restraint. That is how consequential decisions get made in wartime, not through careful deliberation with all relevant information, but through compressed timelines and blocked communication. Not with preparation and perspective, but with incomplete knowledge and institutional silence. Roosevelt's decision to keep Truman uninformed for 82 days created a situation where the most important decision of the 20th century was made by a man with less than 4 months to understand what he was deciding. The military's decision to block the scientists' petition denied Truman access to the moral perspective he needed. The result was 2 cities destroyed, 140,000 dead in Hiroshima, 70,000 dead in Nagasaki. The nuclear age begun, an arms race that would threaten humanity for decades, all because critical information was withheld from the man who had to make the choice. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from history. Subscribe to stay connected with these historical accounts. Each one matters. Each one reveals how decisions that shape the world are often made with less information than we imagine. Leave a comment below, telling us where you are watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories in perspective.